Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2020 Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month program. I am Mercedes Ramirez Fernandez, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer for the Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion at the University of Rochester. I am so delighted to be here. In alignment with our values, it is important for us to acknowledge the ancestral land in which our university stands. With respect to the Seneca Nation, known as the Great Hill People and the keepers of the western door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, we thank you for your grace. We take this opportunity to thank the people on whose ancestral lands the University of Rochester now stands. The Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion is excited to host this program. We believe in the value and importance of celebrating Asian American, and Pacific Islander heritage, not only during the month of May, but every day throughout the year. We're grateful for our program participants this evening. We welcome Ashwin Kumar and Dr. Chunkit Fong, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Esther Choo. Bit of introductions here. Dr. Fong is an associate professor of medicine and public health at the James Wilmot Cancer Institute. He is a division co-director of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and he sits on the board of governors for the Human Rights Campaign. Recently, he joined the Human Rights Campaign AAPI and Proud Working Group. Dr. Fong has graciously agreed to moderate the discussion tonight, so thank you so much. To kick off our program tonight, we're inviting our PhD candidate from the Department of Microbiology and Immunology, Ashwin V.R. Kumar. Ashwin was one of the distinguished nominees for the Change Maker Award for the University of Rochester 2020 Presidential Stronger as One Diversity Awards. He is recognized as an individual committed to fostering diversity and equity and inclusion in academia and research. Ashwin's commitment to serving as a teaching assistant and peer mentor, and his contributions to the DEI Council and other EDI-related university committees is commendable. He is a trusted voice within our university community, and we're honored and delighted to have him with us tonight, and he will be introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Esther Choo. Ashwin?
Right. Thanks so much, Dr. Ramirez Fernandez. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Esther Choo. Dr. Esther Choo is an emergency physician, health policy researcher, and professor of emergency medicine in the Center for Policy and Research at Oregon Health and Science University. She speaks and advises organizations on improving equity in the workplace and the provision of healthcare, and has published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine, Harvard Business Review, Washington Post, NBC Think, and USA Today on these topics. She is a founding member of the Equity Quotient, a company that advises organizations on building a culture of equity, and has served as a columnist for the Lancet and MSNBC, writing on topics related to inequities in healthcare. So let's give a warm and loving virtual welcome to our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much. I will just pull up my slides. Can I have just a thumbs up that you can see my slides? Yes.
Oh, yeah, everything's good.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to start by taking a moment to recognize the events of this week and just honor the victims of the events in Buffalo, Laguna Woods, and Dallas. and I will begin, but I know that these events are weighing heavily on people, and if that means that you need camera off or you need time, I won't take it personally. And I certainly recognize that this is a week where we didn't get a lot of time to just stop and recognize our feelings and the pain of these events. So thank you. I do have a conflict of interest. It was mentioned. I'm the co-founder of a company called Equity&Inclusion that does assessment and consulting related to organizational equity, and I won't mention it for the rest of this presentation. This is an overview of the talk. I will begin briefly with some basic definitions of health equity and DEI. We'll discuss kind of the state of the union, our current workplace inequities, and then we'll talk about how our systems and structures also sustain inequity, not just individuals. And then we'll end the talk with potential solutions. I am really sensitive to time. I have about 40 minutes, and then that leaves room for discussion, which will be probably much more interesting than anything I've prepared, and allow us to honor this, this month as being Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And so I have an alarm, and when it goes off, I will wrap up no matter where I am. But there are portions of the talk where I'll skim through pretty quickly, just to be able to get to the solutions part, which I think is the key portion of the talk. I have a bunch of references. I will refer to studies and articles. If you can capture this URL, or just put your phone up to the QR code that will take you to a Google document. I should have it open. If you just have the link, you should have access to it. And I'll put this up again at the end in case you missed it. And the talk organizers also have it and can share it around for anybody who misses it and wants some of the references. So let's just talk a little bit about what is health equity, because I think that's our ultimate goal as people who work within healthcare institutions. So a formal definition is here. It's the absence of systematic disparities in health between more and less advantaged social groups. The operational definition I sort of carry around in my head as a healthcare worker is this: every patient who walks in the door feels that they were respected and cared for to the best of our ability. And then when we look at data, we find this is statistically true in terms of health outcome. And then in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, each of these words is kind of heavy and has meaning to itself. Diversity simply refers to the similarities and differences that define human beings, define us as human beings. Equity refers to the principle of distributive justice. So it recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So it's different than equality. It's recognizing that sometimes we need to apply distributive justice. Inclusion is the climate that we create to help organizations and individuals benefit from diversity of ideas, knowledge, and experience. And collectively, these are referred to as DEI. So health equity and DEI work are not the same, but the premise of this talk is that health equity work cannot occur without a solid foundation of DEI. And I hope that sounds acceptable to all of you as a premise. So the first thing I wanted to review is just what workforce inequities are we talking about? So if we start with kind of our internal environment, what are the inequities that we're facing within healthcare? And I tend to dwell a lot on pay, on compensation, because it's just so easily measurable. I think you are aware that we have a whole holiday around unequal pay because women and men make such different pay for the same labor that women have to work well into the next year in order to make what men made the previous year. Does that sound familiar to you? So women overall as a whole have to work until March 15th of the following year to make as much as men made the previous calendar year. But there is more than one equal pay day in this country. Mothers would have to work until June 4th. Black women have to work until August 3rd. Native American women till September 8th, and Latina women October 21st. So almost to the next year in order to make equal pay to men. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics has a lot of data that's interactive that you can play with across many different occupations, looking at exactly what the pay differential is. And this is in your list of references. I encourage you to play with it because it's fascinating. And many of the roles embedded in there are healthcare roles. So you can just pick pick the profession and then see where it lands. So healthcare social workers, as a percentage, women making a percentage of men, women make a little bit more than men. So it's kind of nice to know we pay all social workers, whether they're men or women, equally badly. But you can go through and find a lot of different professions, not just in healthcare, but there are a number in healthcare. And for most jobs, women make substantially less than men. And this represents a lot of roles, of course, that we see every single day. This is a wonderful report about the gender pay gap. Again, the link is in your references, but this I like because it does bring in some intersectionality. So things are not as simple as binary gender, but we are limited to what the data shows. But this at least incorporates both gender and race and ethnicity a little bit and shows how far we have to go in gender pay gap for each of these. But there are projections in this report that I really wanted to point out because they estimate what it would take to close the pay gap. So how many years ahead in the future will it take with current rate of improvement to close these gender pay gaps? And you can look, there's an overall trend and then it's broken down by race. But I will just point out this blue bar, which represents the gender pay gap for Black women. And I will just say, if you're tempted to feel like we're making progress and we'll get there, at our current rate, the Black women's pay gap is not expected to close at all. So there is a lot of room to grow. And I just don't want anybody to feel that we can rest on our laurels or that we're on a great trajectory. There are a lot of places where we've stalled. To bring this specifically to the physician pay gap, Doximity for a number of years has put out a physician compensation report. They do adjust for a bunch of key factors, including specialty, geographic location, years in practice, and overall across more than 40,000 full-time physicians, the gender wage gap was about 28%, which was larger than the previous year. And they estimate this is about a $2 million difference over the course of a career, even adjusting for those potential confounders. And again, when we say, well, you know, maybe it's just that we need more women in the specialty, I will point out that there's not a single specialty in which women earn the same or more than men. And that includes specialties that are dominated by women like OB-GYN, or where there are plenty of women represented, pediatrics, family medicine. It doesn't matter what the representation is, women still make less. And again, these are all physicians who are working full-time. So this is not about part-time work. The same can be seen in nursing, another specialty that has been dominated by women for a long time. Female nurses, on average, make less than male nurses. And again, it is frustrating sometimes how there's little data when you get beyond binary gender, but in studies that do pull in intersectionality, there clearly are differences that are compounded when we look beyond simple gender. Wages are so easy to look at because there's numbers attached to it, or relatively easy to look at. There is a lot of complexity in wage analysis, but they're just one element. And inequity is, of course, it shows itself in every element of engaging in our workforce and succeeding and having impact. So when we look at overall representation, triage or segregation to specific specialty or roles within healthcare, leadership roles is a glaring area of inequity, the process of promotion, and the experiences of respect or experiencing abuses. Representation, this is a graph from the AAMC, just showing the percentage of all active physicians by race and ethnicity. And I put in parentheses the population representation of each group compared to the representation across physicians. And you can just take a minute and see. And this is the same data looking at medical school faculty specifically. And then if you look over time, again, I sometimes feel that over time we're just evolving into, you know, a better society that is more equitable and representative. But when you look at some tracking over time, I will say it's not super encouraging. So this is just female faculty, but it's a breakdown by race and ethnicity and the representation in percentage of faculty since 2010 to 2019. And it's basically the white female faculty on top. The orange line is Asian female faculty, and then all the other groups that you see in the legend on the bottom are at the bottom, are in the most inferior lines, and you can see how discouraging, how lack of significant increase there seems to be. And in fact, if I were to interpret this very grossly, it would say any diversity gains that we've had seem to be represented simply by increasing the percentage of Asian faculty. The interesting thing about role segregation, which I mentioned before, is that women are clearly diverted to certain roles within healthcare, including medical specialty, and the money follows the percentage of women. So to the right of this, on the x-axis, are increasing percentages of women represented. On the y-axis, it's the salary. So as you get more women, the salary goes down, and I think that kind of role triage happens the second that you enter, even express an interest in healthcare, and leads to a lot of downstream inequity in power, in resources, in the way that our systems and structures are run. We are not really minorities in the healthcare world, by the way, when you're talking about women. Women make the disproportionate amount of buying and use decisions. They are the consumers of healthcare. 84% of bachelor degrees in the health professions are women. Women are 65% of the overall healthcare workforce, but they're only 30% of C-suite teams, and they're only 13% of CEOs. So really, we don't have a women in healthcare problem. We have a women in leadership healthcare problem. And I think it's clear from data that are coming out that when we talk about representation, yet everybody feels that they're fair to their peers, their colleagues, and the people they supervise. I think it's clear that small incremental differences can compound over time. So this is a study that was published in the New York Times that you can. I think there actually was an interactive component to that, but again, the link is in your references. They just modeled how if you just take performance evaluations and plot out how a small difference over time in getting to each level downstream can magnify, and so can lead to a big difference in terms of women that make it to the upper echelons in terms of leadership. And so I think it's all these things, just small things, year to year, quarter by quarter, that just over time lead to big differences when we look at things like leadership and role and success acquisition and salary as well. I talk a lot about these things that are kind of measurable, where I can say, look at the proportion of women who are chair, and look at over here and the proportion of women of men who are chair, and all these things that are just, I gravitate towards easy data. But when you're sitting at a table of women, of people who are marginalized or minoritized in healthcare, I'll say the conversation tends to drift more to these things that have been called microaggressions, or the day in, day out signals, comments, interactions that really signal that you're other, that you don't belong in this place, or that you will not excel. A quote from this article is that people say that microaggressions are small things, but our studies indicate that microaggressions have a macro impact as they affect the standard of living of a marginalized group. This is an author called Daryl Wing-Sue. Daily microaggressions create a lowered sense of psychological well-being. They deplete psychic energy or problem solving and work productivity. Why? Microaggressions are cumulative. They occur to people of color from the time they awaken until they go to bed, from the time they are born until they die, Sue adds. This is also addressed by Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I do not use microaggression anymore. It's a persistent daily low hum of racial abuse is not minor. I use the term abuse because aggression is not as exacting a term. And I think the way that I would sum up all these things is when we go back to our idea of what we want to do in healthcare systems, we want to provide outstanding care to all of the patients and the populations who need us. And then I think of, are we bringing people into the workforce to work to their highest potential in achieving that goal? I think all the things I've been talking about, being undervalued in terms of pay, in terms of promotion, leadership roles, recognition, and just the way that you're spoken to in the workforce, I think it takes value out of people and it disempowers them against the goals of the institution. This was a quote from Michelle Williams at the Enemies, and I thought it was so powerful. She said, when you put value into a person, it empowers that person. And then where do they put that value? They put it into their work. And that's what I think is the true motivation for all of this DEI work, is that we can make a better workforce that enables entire institutions to better accomplish their ultimate goals with regard to health and health equity for the population. I think the other important component of this is recognizing how much our systems and structures are set up to be inequitable. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is in our very equipment, literally the hardware, everything that we walk in that surrounds us. And I think the most clear example of this that's emerged over the past 2 years, actually the data emerged much earlier, but has really come to public consciousness, is the racial bias that's built into pulse oximetry. This is one study that was published in the New England Journal where they had paired measurements of oxygen saturation by pulse oximetry and then arterial oxygen saturation directly from the arterial blood gas. And they had 2 different cohorts. One was a University of Michigan cohort, and then one was a multi-center cohort. And you can see the numbers. They just had a huge sample size to look at this. And what they found in their first cohort was that if you looked at patients with an O2 sat of 92 to 96%, and then looked at the arterial oxygen saturation directly from the blood, they found that 11% of arterial blood gas measurements in Black patients showed a higher O2 sat on pulse oximetry, but a lower actual arterial oxygen saturation. And that finding was only occurred in 3.6% of white patients. It's called occult hypoxemia. It's hidden because the pulse oximetry is not picking it up. And then in the multi-center cohort, they found that occult hypoxemia was found in 17% of measurements in Black patients and 6.2% of measurements in white patients. And so, you think of someone who's walking into work who was like, I am going to deliver equitable health outcomes to all my patients. And yet, how can that well-intentioned individual do it? How can this wonderful workforce that we've built do it when they are in a system that is not allowing them to do it? And the conclusions of this study were reliance on pulse oximetry to triage patients and adjust supplemental oxygen levels may place Black patients at increased risk for hypoxemia, despite our best intentions, I would add. The other way that inequity is built in is our clinical decision tools. And I think you probably are familiar with these, and I won't belabor them, but I would say in almost every specialty, you cannot escape some clinical decision tool that has built-in bias based on race and ethnicity. And again, we sometimes build these into our EHR, our paper decision tools, the textbooks that we read, the clinical teaching that we have. It is very hard to escape it, even without the best of intentions. And then another one I'll point out, there are a million, but another one I'll point out is our system strategies. This is a wonderful study that's worth spending some time with. It was published in Science. And these investigators looked at a primary care database of an academic health system that had detailed data, including self-identified race. And that health system deployed this algorithmic risk score in order to identify patients with complex health needs who required care management resources. And so patients with a certain score would be directed to coordinated care, and that included all these valuable health resources, dedicated nurses, extra primary care appointment slots, and other scarce resources. And what they found, if you looked for Black patients versus white patients, at any given percentile algorithm risk score, Black patients had worse clinical outcomes. So looking on the left at things like hypertension, blood pressure control, and diabetes severity. Somehow, if you took that algorithm risk score, the score that triggered all the additional resources, Black patients were sicker than white patients on that risk score. And their conclusions were that at a given risk score, Black patients are considerably sicker than white patients, as evidenced by signs of uncontrolled illnesses. Remedying this disparity would increase the percentage of Black patients receiving additional help from 17.7% to 46.5%. This bias arises because the algorithm predicts healthcare costs rather than illness, but unequal access to care means that we spend less money caring for Black patients than for white patients. That study raises so many questions about who was responsible for deciding what triggered additional resources. What was their understanding of healthcare access and how inequity played out in people's lived experiences? And I think this is where this is where my premise comes into play, that when we build the workforce to really have an equity orientation, then we're able to execute health equity. So I have spent about half my time actually talking about the problem. And like I said, I really want to spend some time in solutions. So I may slow down a little bit, but I will pause for a second and just see if there are any questions or comments like you're talking way too fast. Okay, so we'll go on. So the title of this talk is really, so how do we build a healthcare organization of excellence? And these things are all, you might have guessed, focused around the definition of organizational excellence as one that robustly supports equity. And I will say, to start with, whoops, I'm so sorry. Okay, sorry, just want to make sure I was in the right place. So the thing I will start with is going back to the diversity issue and just remembering that our frame around diversity is not that it's the right thing to do. It is, of course, the right thing to do, but I want everybody to always keep in mind how consequential diversity is. And I don't mean that in a vernacular way. I mean consequential as the opposite of deontological. And deontological is really that there is like kind of a moral or an ethical reason to do it. And so I think a lot of people feel like there's a fundamental good to diversity, but I want to go beyond that and say, we cannot execute good healthcare without diversity, and we can't gain or sustain diversity without equity, inclusion, and belonging. That again goes back to my initial premise. But let me show you a few ways that I think, a few studies that really support how consequential diversity is to the work that we're doing. One is this study that was conducted in a primary care clinic in Oakland. You may be familiar with this, but this study recruited young Black men from barbershops in Oakland, and it brought them to a primary care clinic where they were randomized to either a racially concordant doctor, a Black doctor, or a white doctor. And what they found was that subjects who were randomized to a Black doctor were more likely to receive blood pressure and BMI measurements, agree to diabetes and cholesterol screening, and accept the flu shot. And this is, it's done by a team of economists. So they estimated what this would mean over the course of the, if you extrapolate that across the population. And what they found was that there was an estimated reduction in this tenacious Black-white male gap in cardiovascular mortality by 16 deaths per 100,000 per year. That would lead to a 19% reduction in the Black-white male gap in cardiovascular mortality. Another study, this one looked at a database of hospital visits in Florida of Medicare patients who came in having a heart attack. And they looked at, when you go into a hospital, you don't show up and you're like, I will take the female doctor. There's no choice to it. You just have who's on call that day. And so this is looking at what happens if you're a female having a heart attack and your doctor is also a woman, and what happens if you're a female having a heart attack and you come in and your doctor's a male. And they found, I think you can see it here. They basically found if there was female to female concordance, and you can look to the right, there was higher survival if you were a woman who came in and were having a heart attack. So female patients experienced better outcomes in EDs. Female patients experience better outcomes, survival outcomes, if they happen to be essentially randomized to a female doctor. So that is super interesting, of course, but I actually think the study did something even more interesting. They then looked at how did female patients do depending on the gender ratio of that entire department. So if that ED, forget who you came in and got, but how did you do if that whole department just had more gender equity? And they found that female patients experience better outcomes in EDs that have a higher percentage of female physicians, whether or not you got a female physician on the day that you came in. And I love that second part of the study because it hints at what we're getting at, which is not, I think the goal is not perfect concordance. Like I would like to see a female Asian doctor to make sure that my outcome is best. I think that is never anything that we want to or will achieve. I think what it indicates is that when we build teams that are more representative, that are diverse, those teams will perform better. And of course, when you look across industries, that has been shown to be the case again and again and again for any outcome that matters. One final study that I have to put in, which is the physician-patient racial concordance and disparities in birthing mortality for newborns. This is, again, a large database of patients admitted to Florida hospitals between 1992 and 2015. And they found that under the care of white physicians, Black newborns experienced 430 more fatalities per 100,000 births than white newborns. When there is racial concordance, so under the care of Black physicians, the mortality penalty for Black newborns is 173 fatalities per 100,000 births above white newborns, a difference of 257 deaths per 100,000 births and a 58% reduction in the racial mortality difference. So don't let anybody tell you that diversity is just nice to do. It is consequential and it translates into lives that matter to us. So that was my first point. My first point was, remember that diversity is consequential, the most fundamental meaning of that word. The second one is that we should really be deploying strategic frameworks. And it doesn't have to be this framework, it can be another framework, but I really love to ask when I go into an organization, what is the framework that you use? Because I'm so interested in what people choose, but a framework provides a shared vision and understanding of all the components of the actions that an organization is taking towards building an equity framework. It helps galvanize all stakeholders. It helps really create this forward momentum. It helps people understand what the barriers are, the work to remove them, what the processes are, the short-term and the long-term goals. It sustains momentum towards important change. And there's been work in the clinical realm that really shows that when you go in, people are able to say very quickly what their framework for, say, a clinical service is. That institution has better outcomes. And I really think likely the same is true when it comes to institutional equity culture. Organizations in which people come in and they know the framework, the strategy for acquiring both internal and external equity likely has a lot to do with the success of that. I am a stickler for timelines. I think, in 2020, when organizations talked so much about the change that was going to happen, I wanted specifics, So like what exactly, those are great goals. How are those translated into action? And by when should we expect some results? I had that question about my organization, other organizations that I interact with. And it is always on my mind when I hear extremely ambitious goals. I'd like to hear details. When is it going to happen by? Those are the kind of standards that we have when we try to improve patient care. We're really thinking on specific timelines for treatments, for response to treatments. And I would love it if we applied that to our organizational equity practices. And critically, because of the things I mentioned before, the strategy must include change in structures and systems, not just people. I think we tend to get stalled on, can we educate people more? Can we capture individual people when they're not behaving well? That, of course, must happen, but we must also allow people who are prepared, who've gotten their training, who are well-intentioned, and who are committed to also come in and have walls, floors, and ceilings that are enabling them to deliver the kind of equitable care that they want to occur. I think another component is having a shared vision of what a just and equitable culture is. And this is something else that I'm always so fascinated by, because again, I say when there's big statements or big events at organizations that really try to highlight their priority of health equity and also of internal cultures that reflect equity, everyone envisions something a little bit different. And I think coming to a common goal is such an important part of this work. And so, I'd love to ask, what are characteristics of an organizational culture built for equity? What are they? What are your goals at your own organization? Actually, I'm just going to pause and see if you want to put anything in the chat, because I would just like to know. I have a couple of things, but I would like to know what yours are. Whoops, I'm showing my cards there. And I actually can't see chat right now, but I would, if you have anything off the top of your head. Whatever comes to mind when you think of an organizational culture built for equity. It's a big question. Sorry, I had to shush my children. Okay, so here are some of the things that have come up as I've talked to organizations and are similar to ones that we have within my own center. So I think one is there's a clear mission, vision, and values that are imbued with equity for its workforce and its clients. So every institution has mission, vision, and values. And the question is equity strongly represented with priority in that statement? And then to make sure that that mission, vision, and values are linked to actions, there's an operational plan. And that takes the stated values and converts them to action and is tied to clear metrics of success. So they're not vague, they're not simply aspirational, but they're actually linked to something that is going to happen within the realm of reality. I think too, there needs to be an internal environment and external service harmonization. And so there is no, as I've discussed several times, there's no execution of great health equity service in healthcare without an internal environment that also reflects and lives out that value. There just cannot be, because in order to deliver one, you need to have people who are fully empowered within and reflect that value. I think there can also be a big schism between leadership and what is happening on the ground. And that often is what stalls equity work, both internally and externally in terms of the service provided. And so I think it is important for organizations to understand on an ongoing basis the day-to-day lived experiences within the workplace. I think everyone should strive for a just and trusting workplace. Diversity is one thing, but it's more, can you retain a diverse workforce? And how do we optimize employee retention, empowerment, joy? I will put joy in there. We deserve to have joy in our workplace and productivity. And of course, part of that productivity is how we optimize patient care. And then the last one is just a global one, which is I think organizations that don't have humility, who think that they're mostly good, cannot move forward. I think we need to all have humility in this work and understand that whenever we achieve proximal goals, we need to move our goals further so that they are always a little bit unattainable. I think another part of the solutions is bringing data to work fully. I'm a little bit biased, as I am a health policy researcher and I love data, but I am always astounded by how sometimes we don't allow the data to work for us in helping us understand exactly what our organizational challenges are and what our priorities should be, and where we succeed and fail with some of the innovations that we do. So this is taken from the National Quality Forum. This is actually part of a roadmap for promoting health equity and eliminating disparities, but I adapted it a little bit so that you could kind of see how the data collection process really could be applied to DEI work or to health equity and outcomes. But I think there needs to be really like a whole part of the strategy that really thinks about data collection, thinks about stratified outcomes, meaning that we think about the very different populations that might experience various outcomes, that we're not just adjusting for things, but we're actually stratifying and seeing what different experiences are. That we have equity-related process measures, that we really invest upstream in both our innovations and our data collection, that we incentivize efforts, and then always model outcomes from multiple perspectives, as we discussed in that Science article earlier. Just a few additional words on data, and then I'll move on from data. But I do think data collection, it's not as straightforward as you might think. And actually, it's a whole complex process that really itself should be aligned with mission. We want to know that our data are reliable, that they're complete. You'd be surprised how often we think we've measured racial equity, for example, and then we discover, say, 30% of the data points actually have no race or ethnicity data. We want it to be very specific. Something that's driven me crazy over the course of the pandemic is how Asian American Pacific Islander is all one group, as if it's a monolith, when actually there's such incredible diversity of experience in socioeconomic status, in income gap, in experience in the pandemic, and hard outcomes like illness, hospitalization, and death. And all of that was blurred out by lumping people together as Asian American Pacific Islanders. So disaggregation of data, specificity with the data is so key. It needs to be very consistent so that we can compare outcomes over time. We need to validate our variables. So again, back in the science study that I alluded to, talking about how that health system strategy had so much racial disparity in it because they used as criteria for this high needs program a variable that was not very valid, which was healthcare access, instead of considering that access was kind of measuring the wrong thing. So we need to understand our variables. Adjustment versus stratification, I alluded to. Sometimes we can make inequity disappear by adjusting for it when actually we should do stratified analyses and really understand the differences across strata. We need to have clear and meaningful outcomes and understood impact from multiple perspectives. And this is where we really need to engage the communities that the data are meant to represent. And I think that is often done way too far downstream in the process rather than bringing a wide variety of people in foundationally. And then the other thing too is looking at disparities in workforce or in health outcomes requires considerable expertise. And I would say one of my big data pet peeves is assuming that just anybody can just come in and do a health disparities analysis. It is its own science, and we often don't recognize and value that specific type of expertise. And it is so needed right now so that we can even understand the inequities that we're contending with. I think another part that I just can't get away with is disrupting leadership frameworks. I gave you a little bit data before about how there's such inequity in leadership across, say, things like gender. Certainly, it's also true in race, ethnicity, and any number of identities. And I think all of the things that we're talking about are not possible unless there is high leadership buy-in. And I think when leadership is different, looks different, is different representatively, we will start to see more progress towards building strong equity culture. But we cannot say that we have a strong equity culture and change nothing about the way that leadership is allocated. It just doesn't make any sense. We have this whole equity diversity plan, and then people pull up the webpage about the leadership of that hospital, and they're kind of like puzzled, because they're looking at the DEI statement over here, and I'm looking at hospital leadership over there. And I mean, that is the experience of really working in equity right now in healthcare. And I think we have to make some sort of plan so that changes, and so that everything, including the org chart, reflects the kind of values that organizations say they have. And I think, this is a whole talk, but I do think we need to think more about how horizontal and vertical leadership structures are, and think about what it looks to be, how very vertical leadership structures are right now, and think about what it means to have horizontal leadership structures that give more room to pull in representative leadership. We need to stop sort of the magical bequeathing of leadership titles, particularly those that are paid well or with protected time. Things like term limits, rotating roles, succession plans, those are all things that have been deployed by health systems so that leadership change can happen on a specific timeline. I really think there should be a whole effort dedicated to ending role segregation for women and minoritized people of all kinds. I think some of that work, unfortunately, needs to begin like in preschools, but we're responsible for all of it. I think the role triage or segregation begins incredibly early, but we certainly do a lot of it from the minute that people enter the health professions, and we can do a lot of work there. And then again, make the data work for us. We need to routinely assess equity of not just leadership roles as I have here, but all the processes, the decision-making, the mentorship, the sponsorship, and the routes in to successful leadership. And then this, I think, is my last point, which is I've been thinking so much about the power of language, and this is something I'm working on for myself, so I thought I would share out, but I think we need to improve our use of language, what can really serve to shape our frameworks and define how it is that we engage in these topics. This is from a guide put out by the American Medical Association and the AAMC called Advancing Health Equity Guide on Language, Narrative, and Concepts. It's available at that link and in your reference link. But there are many tables like that that just point out language that can be stigmatizing, are harmfully vague, make implications that really stifle our ability to move forward in understanding and in effectiveness around these topics. And so I look at this every time I give a talk, then I look at it after the talk and I realize I still use this language. It is so ingrained in me. And so this is one of those guides that I go back to and that I'm continuously learning from. But I think we can all improve today by using guides like this and making sure that our language conveys what it is that we want, and also that we internalize what is conveyed by better language, which is really historical understanding of inequities in healthcare and in society. Oh, this is the last, sorry. I think there's a lot of ways that we trip up in this work. And so here's a few that are so common. I think, there's a little bit of the late woebegone phenomenon. Everyone thinks they're not perfect, but they're above average. Somebody has to be below average. It's so tough to recognize our own, to see our own privilege. We are so afraid that if we just dig a little, we'll open a Pandora's box that will feel overwhelming. So some people would rather just not engage. There is this enduring belief that if others gain, I lose, so I need to protect my own. That's such a strong belief that I think keeps people from really engaging in equity work. I think there's so many good intentions, and sometimes we just stall there without translating those to granular and meaningful actions. Distractions from purpose. And you saw that a lot during the pandemic, I think, where we're like, oh, equity is important once we've dealt with the pandemic. It wasn't part of the urgency of dealing with the pandemic. And that is part of what led to such inequitable outcomes. I will end there because my alarm just went off to leave room for discussion, but thank you for your attention. Again, here's the link in the QR code to the references and I will also put in there my email if there's any reason you want to contact me or have additional conversation, but I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choo, for joining us tonight, this evening, to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month celebration. Thank you. What a great talk. We all learned a lot. So I guess this is now question and answers sessions, and I think audience can post questions in the chat box. I want to ask you a question, and it's personal to me. As you know, anti-Asian crime and xenophobia have been highlighted in the news more recently. For example, my parents who live in New York City, they're both immigrants. I came here, I'm first generation Chinese American. They're afraid to even ride the subway now because seeing all these hate crime going on against AAPI communities. And of course, it's not a new phenomenon. So I would love to hear your experience you have had, just in general, in the community, inside, outside the hospital, of anti-Asian hate and xenophobia. How do you navigate it? Has your approach changed over time in how to address these issues? And what are some of the best practices recommendations for navigating anti-Asian racism?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot of solutions, but I certainly, there's been a sea change, just as you say. I mean, before the pandemic, there's always, you would occasionally experience something. And I've had a couple of experiences where I was traveling with my parents, but I was like sitting some distance from them behind on a plane. And I noticed how people would speak to them differently. If I wasn't right there as someone who is clearly a native English speaker, if they were on their own a little bit and I was just observing them with their accents and being older, the way that people interacted with them was incredibly different. So the dismissive, rude, people clearly thought if you have an accent, you also are hard of hearing, just like how loudly people would speak to them. And just like the lack of respect. And I always felt so protective of them outside of our home, especially traveling around where I didn't have a lot of control. So I felt like that for a long time. And then with the pandemic, I just felt like it was that experience on steroids, where there was real aggression. And I haven't had an experience where there was actual violence, but certainly, you know, I forget the estimate of how much anti-Asian hate crimes have gone up, but it's like, you know, astronomical. And I think the other thing we know is that these are underreported, because a lot of people, like my parents, are always like, you know, you don't complain, you don't let it go, let it go. There's a comedian on Netflix who has this whole special called Homecoming King. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's, I'm forgetting his name, but in it, embedded in this wonderful comedic storytelling, is this incident with his father where somebody, you know, vandalized their car and his father just went out and swept it up and was like, we're not going to complain about this. We're grateful to be here. And so I think these things are really underreported, but I have felt that change. It was really since the spring of 2020 with the China flu, you know, and all of this xenophobia that came along with COVID. I have just felt this difference, and you see it in the hospital. And I had a peer who's not, it wasn't a patient, their colleague actually had an outburst against them where they were like, you brought this virus in, and now look at what's going on in this hospital, and just had this total meltdown. And that person who did that got suspended for a while and then came back. But, you know, it was just, and then I have all these friends, and especially in New York and San Francisco, who are either, oh, it's Hassan Minhaj. Thank you. Yes. It's just the most wonderful special. I've watched it like 3 times, but, you have to watch it for that moment too, because I just thought it was so poignant and meaningful and spot on. But, you know, so many of my friends are like, you know, they spend their volunteer time just offering to take elderly people to the market or run their errands with them, because our elders, you know, it's been so specifically against our elders, I think, is also like what is so difficult. I mean, again, Laguna Woods, when you attack a patient, a place of worship, those are our elders, right? By definition. And so I think the physician who died at Laguna Woods, who was 52, was by far the youngest person there. But you know, I just think so many of my friends will only work from home in these big cities because that commute has not be the risk of that commute is not worth it to them. So even at risk of their productivity or, you know, their supervisor's desire for them to come back. And so, you know, so what are the solutions? Well, I will say, just to flip it to hope, I will say we are talking about these things in addition to what this hate does to Asian American and Pacific Islander mental health in this time. We're talking about it at a level that is surprising to me. And in a good way. And I think there's more outpouring of support. There's more networks. We have more outspoken role models to really talk about what it is to experience these things, to support each other, to raise funds, to have organizations, to seek mental health. You know, the chef David Chang has been very outspoken about his experience with depression. Jeremy Lin of Linsanity fame, you know, he's been very outspoken about being depressed while he was isolated for COVID and needing a therapist, and just needing to admit that he needed a therapist so that he could get a therapist in China, and what that meant to him and his, you know, his self-identity. So I do think the amount of dialogue, the amount of activism, I think those things are so positive. And because I think stigma is such a big part of why this is hard for us to really address. I don't have any other long-term, you know, sort of solutions, but except to tap into those networks and really understand that we are a community working on this together.
Yes, thank you. So I know there's some other questions, but I just want to tie in one. I mean, we have remaining 5 minutes. There's so many allies in the room tonight. And as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I really believe in allyship to make any meaningful changes. So my question to you is, as another message, I mean, allies plays an important role in creating change. What is the role of allies, and how can they support the AAPI community fighting anti-Asian American discrimination and violence? Like, what's your, in several sentences, what was your word of wisdom to all our allies in this room tonight? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just say, recognize that part of tropes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is that we are quiet and invisible, you know, and non-complaining and submissive. And so those who amplify our voices or or look to see the hate and the discrimination and actually speak up, not for us, but with us, that is very helpful, because I do think our experience is one that's often overlooked and is actually part of, I think part of the hate we face is not expecting us to make noise when these things happen.
Thank you. So I see two questions. I think we can kind of tie them in together, maybe the last question of the night. One question is, to your knowledge, is there an organization that best embodies a culture of excellence? And then I guess to tie into that, what do you suggest any way to catalyze the rate of more inclusion and diversity in leadership positions? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, so as far as organizational excellence, I'm always asked that, and I hesitate to provide one, because literally it's like, I will name one and the next day they'll be in the news for some like big discrimination lawsuit. And I think what I've learned is that everyone's organizational problem either occurred yesterday, today, or tomorrow. No one is perfect. I do think organizations are excellent in certain areas. So everybody has an area in which they're doing well. But I think in terms of thinking about how inequity is embedded into every single thing that we do over the course of the day and over the course of years in the mission of a healthcare center, I think everybody has blind spots. And so I'll just say that we're all striving. And I think in terms of catalyzing big changes, including in leadership, I think what we need to ask our organizations to do now is to really have concrete, specific, attainable goals on a timeline. Show me the plan. And it's okay for it to be overly ambitious, but it's like, and it also doesn't have to be a plan for 6 months from now. It can be 5 years. You can have humility and just say, this is so hard for us. It will take 5, 7, 10 years to achieve this, but have a specific plan that people can look to and hold the organization accountable for. I think we are drowning in vague intent without hard outcomes or timelines.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choo. We really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for sharing your insight and perspective. Thank you for being here tonight. Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate everyone's time and attention, and it's been an honor to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Choo, this evening. Thank you so much to all of you all for joining us tonight. Chunkit, thank you so much for saying yes and being a part of this program. You as well, Ashwin, for always being a willing and enthusiastic participant. Thank you to our interpreters who made this program a success as well. And to my colleagues in the Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion, we are so grateful for your diligence in making this program a delight. In particular, our lead organizer tonight, Dr. Ashley Campbell. I want to just quickly share with you some information about upcoming events that may be of interest. As part of its Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month celebration, the Penfield Central School District is hosting a presentation by Dr. Ho Chang Ben Lee on growing up Asian and parenting Asian teenagers, issues of identity, invisibility, and community. And if I can quickly put in the chat the registration link. Also, this Friday, we are partnering with some postdocs and trainees who wanted to offer a event where we can share all types of food across the Asian Pacific Islander communities, and that event is happening on this Friday. And I will also provide a link in the chat for folks to join. It's Friday at 11:30. But thank you all. We are now at 7:01 for joining us this evening. Hang around if you'd like to get those links, or you can also visit our website at rochester.edu/diversity to get some more information. Thank you, everybody.